Hey, how's it going? It's Jesse of the formerly REI Conversion Podcast, now called the Landlocked Podcast, because we've now completely rebranded to Pebble. So we've got a great guest here on our first rebranded show with Mike Marshall, and we're going to be talking all about adding value and entitlement for properties. It's one of these mystical things that a lot of us who are just flipping kind of avoid because there's not a lot of clarity. Now, I had a previous guest here, Travis King, talk a little bit about this, but we're going to dive a little bit further on this with Mike on this show as he really specializes in that. And we're talking 2x to 5x the amounts of profits you can get out of your current inventory. But before we get to that, if you are looking to scale, to systemize, to make land investing a lot more organized, check out pebblerei.com. Pebble is a system that helps you clean up your entire land investing business process, really helping you to build and think in systems. Pebble is going to handle things like your mailing, automated mailing, daily drip mailing, and we're agnostic to the kind of mailing strategy you want to send out there, whether it's blind offers to ranged offers, whatever it may be, handling leads, buyers and seller leads, handling documents, generating documents on the fly, task list for the team functionality, doing your due diligence, property recording, data management, media management, all for your properties. You really run and centralize your entire land investing out of the one platform. So if you're interested in learning more, you've gotten started it with land, or you're simply getting started and want to build a strong foundation to actually be able to grow a sustainable and scalable business, make sure you head over to pebblerei.com. We recently rebranded. If you want to jump on a call with me, you can head up to the top and hit the book a demo button. It is a one-on-one demo with me. We can sort of chat about some of the challenges you're facing when it comes to growing your business, and see if this is even a good fit for you. So make sure you head over to pebblerei.com. Other than that, I'm not going to hold this up any longer here. Enjoy this show here. You're going to get tons of value here with this interview with Mike Marshall. Cheers. Hey, how's it going? It's Jesse here. I've got a special guest, as I mentioned, Mike Marshall. Mike, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing really well. Very happy to be here.
Awesome. Mike, I want you, I've had a previous guest by the name of Travis King. We've talked about certain things, and I feel like this is going to expand on it even more. I'd like to get an understanding, how did you get started in land, and what are you exactly doing right now?
Sure. Early on in life, I had exposure to real estate through my parents. My dad owned a couple multifamily properties. And so that was my real initial entryway into real estate. So I always had that interest. And then kind of coming out of college, I ended up working for a couple different cities in Texas and in California in the planning and zoning department. And during that time, I did that for about 15 years or so. And during that time, I really worked on everything from like custom single family homes to 2,000 lot, residential subdivisions to medical office buildings, and then ultimately a really large TV and movie studio campus. And so during that whole time, I really worked in this realm of entitlements. And entitlements is really just the first part of the overall development process. And so really what I did is I was working on those government approvals essentially in terms of the overall development, and then always had that bug, for me to do my own thing essentially. And so just one day looking around on the internet, and coming across one of those land investment, programs, and just jumped into it. And I ended up doing my own, land flips and was doing that. But I quickly realized that I had an opportunity to do a little bit more and then really help other people in the space as well.
I love it. You said a word there. Let's take that back. You said entitlement. What does that actually mean?
Right. Great question. And it's a really, kind of a fancy word for something that's not terribly fancy, but really what it is that it's the very first part of the development process. And the development process can really be broken down to three chunks. There's the entitlement phase, which is really the first part. Then there's maybe the horizontal improvements. So it's like all the underground improvements, and that's usually through like an engineering department at the city. And then there's the building permits portion. And that's really what most people think of in development. They think of it in terms of the building permits, but that's really the last step in the overall process. So entitlements are just really the government approvals. It's giving you the initial approval to use a piece of land in a certain way or to develop it in a certain way. And so it's really relative to zoning essentially. And it controls everything from intensity of development, like residential density, how much
Mm.
commercial space you can get on a property, architecture, building height, setbacks, land uses, a variety of different things, but it's controlling how a property is ultimately going to be used. And entitlements are that approval document that you get at the end of that process.
Now, I'd love to dive into the entitlement process, and we can talk a little bit about that. But you told us how you got into all of this. I mean, what can you actually do with a piece of land? Can you sort of give us some ideas here?
Yeah, sure. The word entitlements is kind of like an umbrella term, because a lot of
Mm.
things fit underneath it. And so things that fit underneath it are that we're really, more familiar with are like subdivisions, zone changes, annexations, where you're bringing, a property from a county into the jurisdiction of a city.
Wow.
Things called conditional use permits for kind of land uses that are maybe not fitting with a particular zone. There's a whole basket of things that fit underneath that umbrella. But the one that's most common that people in the land space really are going to be familiar with is the world of subdivisions. And
Mm.
so, as we know, in subdivisions, you're making your money because it's kind of like the Costco effect, right? You buy something in a large quantity, you break it down to smaller pieces, and you're able to charge more for it on a per acre basis. And that's just, how pricing actually works in most instances. And so the subdivision process is the one that's most common. And the whole concept is that you're able to take these entitlements and add value, and that's kind of the distinguishing factor because most of us come up in the land space making our money by, making really great offers and getting those offers accepted, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody should continue to do that. But there's the other side of the coin, and the other side of the coin is being able to add value. And that's what entitlements will allow you to do.
Got you. Got you. So we're talking about adding value. Now, you mentioned subdividing is probably one of the most common ways for land investors
Mhm.
to add value. I mean, is this the one that most land flippers should start with? Um,
Yeah, it's a great question. I think more often than not, yes, that is the case, because you take the whole world of just entitlements, then you can break it down into subdivisions. And then in the world
yeah.
of subdivisions, there's even different types of subdivisions. And
Mm,
some of those are actually more streamlined. They're easier to get through, cheaper to get through. And, one of the common, criticisms about the entitlement process is that it's long and it's costly. And a lot of times it
okay.
really is. So you have to have a different mindset about it. In the land space, we're in a way spoiled sometimes because things move a little bit faster, and in most of other parts of real estate, things tend to move a little bit slower. So it's always this balance point between, a land flip being maybe faster, but maybe not as many dollars at the end of it. Whereas an entitlement play or any value add play, it's going to take longer, but you're going to get more out of it at the end. And so, in terms of subdivisions, there's different types, like I mentioned, and the easiest way to explain it is that there's a process that every state will require that's called a platting process, where you actually
Mm,
have to have a subdivision mapped and reviewed by the county, and it goes through this lengthy process, and ultimately, hopefully, it gets approved. Then you can go and get it recorded. There are exceptions to that platting requirement in many states that allow you to go through that process much faster, much cheaper, not as many professional services that you need to get involved. Typically, you only need a surveyor. And this can make the process a lot faster and cheaper. And that makes it
mm.
more palatable for a beginning land investor that's getting into subdivisions because, again, it's quicker, it's cheaper, and they can realize those results much faster.
So, if somebody were to go down this path and add value or subdivide on a piece of property, other than time, and I'd like to know, how much time should they be thinking about? Other
Sure.
than time, what else are they actually losing out on? Like, why would somebody not want to do this?
Yeah, I think most of the time it's either lack of knowledge and that they're just not familiar with it yet, and
Yeah.
so there's that the fear of the unknown. I think that plays into it significantly, and then there's the
Hmm.
time element as well, like you mentioned, because that's going to take a little bit longer. So for the most basic type of subdivision that I'm talking about, you really have to figure, probably in the realm of like 3 to 4 months just to get through that actual subdivision process. During that time, though, you could really start your marketing. If you have a land agent that you're working with, they can start their marketing. So you can really kind of overlap some of those processes so that way you're streamlining things as much as possible. But I think really it comes down to time and knowledge. But really, once people understand it and they kind of get their feet wet and a couple of those under their belt, they start to realize that it's not as challenging as they may have thought. Ultimately, what I tell people is that you don't have to be the subject matter expert. You just need to be
Mm,
able to be a good project manager. You need to be able to
mm.
manage the professional services.
Now, when let's say you're coming to subdivide on a piece of property, would you be notified pretty much early on in the process, or do you really have to wait that 3 to 4 months at the end when you've already started marketing to actually know, and then you've spent all this time marketing the wrong
Yeah.
thing? Is that how it happens?
Generally, no. There's, especially with the most simple type of subdivisions, you're going to know really early on because you're working with a
Mm,
surveyor who knows what all the standards are and all the
right.
requirements. And they're going to be able to tell you, like, hey, this really isn't going to work because of this reason or that reason. We're going to have to shift. We're going to have to do something else. The surveyor or the civil engineer, when you get to the more complex subdivisions, they're going to be really your guiding force. They're going to be the one that's out
Mm,
there that really knows the local regulations, and they're going to be able to help you out. So you'll be able to figure that out early on. And then really, as you get to become more familiar with the subdivision process, you're going to be able to understand what those regulations are before you even talk to the surveyor. So you're going to be able to disqualify ones much quicker before you even get in touch with the surveyor. And then the surveyor becomes like your second level of defense.
got you, got you. Now, I'm assuming again the official word doesn't happen till the end, but working with a surveyor, you'll probably get a pretty solid idea by that time.
That's correct.
Um, now, what are some of the more common signs or red flags which probably mean you can't add value?
Right. So it's going to be different for each type of entitlement that you go through. So, for example, of a subdivision, the ones that are going to be the biggest, obvious ones are going to be if your lot sizes that you're cutting down to
Mm,
are actually too small or too small for what the zoning would allow for. So, for example, if you have to have a minimum 1 acre lot size and you only have like a lot that's 1.5 acres in size already, you can't
yeah.
split that down to something that actually works. You have to have enough land area. So that's really the first indicator, is really understanding what your minimum lot size requirement is, and then if you can actually cut it down to that size. The other one that's really key too, though, is minimum lot width, or it's sometimes referred to as minimum lot frontage. And that's referring to the width of the lot as it faces onto a public roadway. And
Mm,
so, for example, some jurisdictions may have it where it's a 100-foot minimum lot width. Well, if you don't have at least 200 feet of lot width to play with, you can't split it in half and get to your 100, right? So that's the other key factor. It's really those two in the world of subdivisions, especially the more
mm,
simple ones, that you really use to kind of disqualify at the very beginning. So that's with
gotcha.
regards to subdivisions. But regarding, things like zone changes, when you're getting more complex, or conditional use permits, it becomes a little bit more complex in that you have to understand that every jurisdiction, whenever they're making their decisions, there's a set of criteria that they use to be able to make those decisions, and that criteria is published in their zoning code, and it's called findings. And it's certain findings that they need to make. Another word, again, criteria is probably a better word for us. And that
Yeah.
criteria basically just says you have to be able to do A, B, C, and D. There's certain statements that they need to be able to make, saying that
Right.
what you're proposing is consistent with the surrounding development patterns, things like that. So my point to that is that if you're getting into the world of more complex subdivisions, looking at what those findings are and being able to really answer those questions is really the clear way of actually going about it, to be able to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Got you. Got you. Now, other than subdividing, what else is quite common? If you were to say, here's the top three ways that most land investors would add value or can add value, um,
Yeah.
what would you say those typically are?
The top one is going to be subdivisions. The
Yeah.
next one is going to be zone changes. And then
Mm,
probably the next one after that is going to be what we call site plan review.
okay.
And a site plan review is essentially when you're actually reviewing the actual proposed developed project. And so the
Mm,
most simple thing would be a house on a lot. And so you're looking at, it's a site plan is a top down view of what the property actually looks like. It's going to show the actual property lines. It's going to show the dimensions. It's going to show the proposed house and the dimensions, the setbacks, all these other things. And ultimately, what you're looking at is getting a house approved, and that's called a site plan approval. And it usually includes a site plan and a floor plan and maybe the elevations, like how the building looks on the outside.
Yeah.
But that is kind of like the final stop in the whole entitlement process. And we talk about providing a development package, or an entitlement package
Mm,
rather. That entitlement package is kind of multi-layered, where there's more than one entitlement that fits into this entitlement package. And
I see.
so part of that would be the subdivision, and then the rezoning if it's necessary, and then the site plan review for the actual houses. So like that would be like the most common way of going about it. And of course, there's commercial applications to this as well in the commercial space. But ultimately, for us as land investors, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create something of value, and that ultimate value is that entitlement package. So whatever
Mm,
is required to get that property fully entitled, that package is what we want to hand over to our buyer, and that's what's
wow.
providing the ultimate value.
So really, when we're talking about site planning, you're essentially doing all the homework for whoever's going to end up keeping that property, or taking that property off your hands.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why we're adding value, or we're getting value out of it, is because we're adding certainty. The
Mm,
world of development is a very uncertain world, and that's why it has the perception of risk, rightfully so. And what we're
yeah.
doing is we're eliminating a portion of that risk for the developer or the builder. So that way, when they come to us, they go, all right, this thing's fully entitled. There's no more
Mm,
discretion. People's opinion doesn't play into it anymore. Really, from their perspective, I just have to meet the building code requirements, which are much more, yes or no, right or wrong.
right. Right. So let's go back to that second one, zoning.
Yeah.
What typically do people rezone their property for?
Sure. Yeah. It's basically the most common thing that we would see in land space would be seeing like an agriculturally zoned property that we deal with all the time, right? We'll see
Yep.
an ag zone property and we want to be able to sell this to a builder ultimately. You're going to rezone it from agricultural to a residential land use. So you might see that as like an R1 zone or whatever it happens to
Right.
be in that jurisdiction. So that's the most like common transition as far as zoning is concerned, but it could also be more subtle than that too. It could be from like a zone that allows for a fourplex type property, and it could
Hmm.
actually be rezoned to something that allows for multifamily, 5+ units or something like that. So sometimes there's subtle zoning changes, but those subtle changes actually add massive value, because now it's important to remember that property and land is valued in part based on what its potential actually is. And so what
Right.
we're doing is we're changing the potential of that property. And that's again why we're actually getting paid as adding value to it.
Got you. Got you. So, what do you have to say to those that are thinking, okay, that seems all great.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I, you know, it just seems like more work to do.
Mhm.
What can they sort of like? Let's give the listeners something a little bit tangible. What can they sort of expect on an increase in added value when you're going through these entitlement processes?
Right, right. It's something like a real basic subdivision, like I was mentioning at the entry level. It's
Yeah.
very common to have like a 2.5x, 3x on it.
Wow.
That's very common. When you're talking about zone changes, for example, it could be far, far greater than that. It's just because what it is, it's about the potential now, right? And you're
Right.
eliminating the discretion in it. And so you could see something in, 5+x easy on something like it's a rezoning. Now, it just
Mm,
depends on the situation and the circumstances. Something like a real basic subdivision, though, two and a
yeah.
half to 3x is very, very common and very, very
Mm.
achievable.
And
Especially,
again,
especially if you're buying at the prices that a lot of land investors are buying at, right? Because the thing about adding value is that theoretically you could buy right up to the retail level and add
right.
value and still come out okay. So every percentage that you get off of that retail price, you're just adding that to your picture. So the cool part is that if people out there in your market are buying at 40% of market value consistently, well, I can go and I can maybe add, ask or offer 50 or 60 or something like that. And I could beat out my competition because I know that I'm not relying on just that underplay. I'm actually be going over by adding value too. So my
Right.
suggestion is to always try to do for both, understanding that you're going to be in a position to add or to ask for, or to provide rather, more of an offer to the person because you're actually
Mm.
in a scenario where you're adding value on the back end.
I know you're enjoying the show episode so far, but I wanted to let you know that if you are looking to build or scale a serious land business, perhaps a 6-figure second income or eventually a 7-figure land investing empire, Travis King's company, Land Investing Mastery, has the most current and innovative education in the space. Travis goes beyond the traditional microflip that you might be familiar with and shows you how to 10x your deal size and execute on strategies like subdividing, portfolio takedowns, land sniping. We're talking 6-figure per flip strategies. If you're getting your education from someone who isn't actively investing, you're more than likely going to hit some plateaus as you try to scale. If you want to learn how to avoid the saturated red ocean markets, skip over the small stuff, and learn how to become a boss land investor, then Travis is your guy. Travis has completed nearly 1,000 coaching calls in the last 2 years that I've known him, and he has his pulse on the market. He will tell you, though, Land Investing Mastery is not a factory. They're a boutique agency built on transformational, life-changing results. You see, I'm in a really unique position, and I really mean what I've just said above. In fact, I get to speak to a lot of investors from all sorts of different education, training, coaching background out there, and I get a very good view of things from all the one-on-one demo calls that I've done. Now, you may want some social proof. Head over to pebblerei.com/Travis and check out Travis's wall of love on his testimonial page. And while you're there, you can also learn more about Travis's training programs and his exclusive mastermind. So simply head over to www.pebblerei.com/Travis for more information. Gotcha. I love that. So that really trickles down to really their marketing efforts now too, to kind of take this into consideration then.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I tell people too, I mean, everybody right now in this day and time, we're looking at how the economy's shifting and what everybody's doing to address that, And
Yeah.
so, I would never propose to anybody, especially right now, just to solely rely on this as the only exit strategy. They need to be
Yep.
able to line up 2 or 3 exit strategies. So in my
Mm-hmm.
sense and the way I'm looking at it is number one, I still want to try to buy and get a good deal on something.
Yep.
Number two, I still have my plan A as this value add component, but then I'm going
Yep.
to have a couple other backups. So I want to be able to buy at a place where I know that I can at least still flip it and at least
Yep.
make my money back at worst case scenario, but try to get some money out of it. But then maybe also a plan C is maybe I do seller financing, or a plan D is that I find somewhere to lease it to, whatever it happens to be. I just want to be able to line up different multiple options at this point. And I think that's
Right.
just wise really in any market, but especially right now.
Got you. Mike, out of this show, I love for the listeners to actually get something actionable out of this. Let's say somebody wanted to get started with adding value to a piece of property they're just about to acquire.
Mhm.
Can you give us a checklist? And for all of you that are listening, I'd like you to pull out a pen and paper and write this down here. What should they go through? A checklist right now, to start on this process if they wanted to go about it.
I think the first thing that they should do is focus on subdivisions. First of all, I think that's going to
Okay.
be the first place to start for land investors for sure.
Okay.
The next thing is to focus on these more simple type of subdivisions that I was mentioning. So I'm talking about subdivisions that are exempt from that platting process I was mentioning. That
Yep.
platting process is that full, lengthy process, high level of review, etc. Every state and county will have some form of exceptions that are associated to it. I've gone through and put together like this research basically on which states do have them and which don't. And there's about
Okay.
17 states out there that actually have some favorable form of the subdivision exceptions that I'm mentioning. So what you want to
Yeah.
do is you really want to go to the county that you're working in and look at the subdivision regulations. And you can call the county and ask this question too, or you could look because it's all online. You're going to look at what they call the platting requirement for that county that you're working in. And then
Yep.
keep reading in that section. There'll be an exceptions list. They'll say, well, here's the exceptions. So it'll basically say you have to plat every subdivision, but with the exception of these circumstances, you don't. And those are the types of subdivisions you want to work on. And so it may say something like, hey, you know what, in this county or this state, if you cut these things down to 10 acres or greater, then you're
Mm,
going to be exempt from the platting process. So that's what you want to know, because what that does, that gives you a criteria for whenever you do your marketing, whether it's direct mail or text or whatever you happen to be doing, it's going to give you this criteria. So now I'm going to go into my data provider and I'm going to actually go and filter that down. So if I know that I'm looking for lots that are, I'm going to cut down to at least 10 acres in size, I know that I
yeah.
need to search for stuff that's at least 20 to be able to cut it down. So one into two in that scenario. So that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to establish what the criteria actually is for that county. And you can find that out, like I said, in their subdivision ordinance online, or calling the planning department in your county and talk through it with them and saying, look, I just want to look at those types of subdivisions that are exempt from your platting process. And can you help guide me through that? And they'll help you do that and just kind of point
Are
you.
are counties pretty and the planning department are they pretty helpful typically when it comes to subdividing?
Yeah, once you're able to get hold of them, right? That's the
Yeah,
challenge,
yeah,
sometimes.
yes,
But
right.
once you're on the phone with them, and you just tell them
Yeah,
what you're looking for. And if you kind
yeah,
of, come across as being a little bit more informed, and that you're going to be mindful and prudent of their time, then
yeah,
you're going to be just fine. But like I said, you can find that all, online as well. But to give you an idea of some of the states that are more favorable, Texas, South Carolina, North Carolina, Nebraska, Arizona, Alaska, even. That's just a handful of the states that are really have more favorable regulations. And it's just the right place to start if you're a land investor trying to add value. Is you really should do this and just look at it as an opportunity. The other thing I'd say is really look at your existing inventory. If you're sitting on inventory right now,
mm,
look at that right now, because you might have opportunities sitting there that you're just not even aware of.
yeah, yeah. I love it. Um, all about adding value here. Mike, you have a site. Can you tell us a little bit about, or site or a service, but can you tell us a little bit about how you sort of work with land investors typically?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a website. It's called entitleandflip.com.
Yeah,
You can go there, and it basically lays out, our whole approach, and really what it is we're working with land investors primarily in a more of a coaching and consultative capacity. And
yeah,
people that are a part of our group, essentially what it is, there's a back of, shop type page, there's a membership page where they have access to all of our educational courses, all of our continuing education and newsletter, all these things. We have group calls twice a month. But really, the real key thing is that for people that have deal flow that's starting to come in, or they're looking back at their existing inventory, we
yeah.
basically are sitting down with everybody on a one-on-one basis, and it's an unlimited situation. There's no limit to how many consultative calls you can have with me. You can do as many as you need. It kind of ebbs and flows as people's business ebbs and flows, but the idea is that we're sitting down and we're going through your actual deal. So we're looking at it from a due
Mm,
diligence perspective. We're also going to look at it from the perspective of what opportunities exist in terms of entitlements. And then we help get you through that process ultimately as well. So we're going to basically walk with you, hand in hand through that whole process and get you to the finish line to where you get, like this example, like a subdivision actually done and recorded. And so it's
got
not
it.
just subdivisions, like I mentioned, and it's not just land, necessarily. It does also have applications in the commercial setting. It does have applications, like I said, regarding rezoning and annexations and a variety of other entitlements. But for most folks starting out, this subdivision concept is where they really get their feet wet.
So who is this for? Is this
Yeah.
for somebody who's starting out? Who would you typically recommend to come in and check out the resources that you have?
Yeah, I think anybody could certainly come in and check out the resources that we have. But I will say this, that most people that we're working with are people that have been in the business for probably at least a year. And now let me
Yeah,
be clear, I don't have a criteria that I'm telling you it has to be this or that,
sure.
but really what it is that, most people tend to have their business going pretty strong. They
Hmm.
have a good number of deals under their belt. They're probably in the realm of at minimum like 25 deals, and they're probably more often much higher than that. But these
Yeah.
are mainly folks that have a lot of their systems in place at this point. They're not looking to change their existing flipping business or replace it. They're looking to add on, which is great. I don't ever
Right.
advocate that anybody do that. And they're looking for ways to add on and diversify and kind of separate themselves from other, competition that's in their market.
Yeah. Yeah. This is huge. I think this is huge. Um, now, how can they find your site again?
Sure. Yeah. If you go to entitleandflip.com, You can
Yeah.
get to our website, you get all those resources. We also started a podcast recently called the Dirty Real
Nice.
Estate Show. You can check that as well. That's linked
Yeah.
on our page as well. And then we also have a lot of content that's for free on our website too. We just have a running blog of all of our social media posts that are going, and we really try to do everything we can to add value and put things out there that talk everything about the whole world of entitlements and subdivisions and how we can actually add value to property. And we're trying to do it where we're adding value without really ever physically having to touch the property. There's ways to
Love
add
that.
value by cutting in roads and clearing land, which are all great and wonderful and things that we do. But we're trying
Yeah.
to do this in a way where we're not really ever having to physically touch the property. And we're just essentially moving paper and using our knowledge to add value.
Got you. Mike, I'm checking out the podcast here. I see our good friend Eric is here. I had no
Yeah.
idea there's a connection here.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Eric and I met like years ago at another event, and then we've just kept in
Yeah.
contact. And then he has a real
Yeah.
passion for doing this, and he just reached out
Yeah.
to me saying, "Hey, you know what? You want to co-host this with me?" And he has like the production side down, and he
Yeah.
does all of that, and he adds his unique perspective, and then
Love
I
it.
just kind of come in with a lot of the technical stuff. And so yeah, we're having a good time with it.
Love it. Eric's a great guy. A shout out to Eric. Eric and I sort of met a couple years back as well. So
Yeah.
great to see that you've started that up with him. Mike, is there anything else that I sort of skipped over here that you wanted to reemphasize when it comes to adding value for properties?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been really thorough. We've hit a lot of the bases. I would just say that, for anybody that's considering it, really take the time to look at it. Really
Yeah.
take the time to look at it and say, I don't need to go big necessarily at the beginning. I
Hmm.
can start with just one
I love
subdivision
that.
and see how it sits with me. See if it's something that that resonates with you and that you can deal with. I think that if once you understand that you're going to have team members in place that are going to really be a lot of the technical experts, that's going to be really helpful for you. So you don't need to be the subject matter expert. You just need to know where to go to and be able to manage a team towards a successful conclusion.
I almost feel like this can be somewhat of a semi-repeatable process once you really understand the process of entitlement. Is that correct?
Yeah, it can be very repeatable. And the thing that I'd say too, especially with the subdivisions and these exempt subdivisions we've been talking about, it could be very repeatable. I think the thing that people will eventually kind of come to realize is kind of what their preference is and what their tolerance level is, because
Mm,
a lot of these things will take time. A lot of them kind of have a lot of nuance associated to it. On huge projects, it can kind of get a little political with the local jurisdiction. Some people are happy to do that and are okay with that because they understand what the payoff is on the back end. Somebody probably like me, I'm a little bit different where I like to kind of fly under the radar, and I like to do it where, I could just repeat processes and make it very systematic.
yeah,
And in
yeah.
that scenario, you can do these really exempt subdivisions. And once you find out what those exemptions are on a state by state level, you can really just hop around the country or even in one state and build a whole business just doing these little exempt subdivisions.
I love it. Talking about adding value here, it really opens up your mind, and even trickles down to marketing, as we mentioned earlier. Mike, we're going to include your link in our show notes, so make sure that you check that out. Mike, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks again for sharing all the wealth of knowledge that you've accumulated over these years and starting to help land investors out.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it, Jesse.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
All right. Take care, man.